The case I'd like to talk about is the Challenger space shuttle accident. This is the space shuttle accident that took place back in 1986. This has been studied by Amy Edmondson, one of my colleagues from Harvard Business School. The infamous teleconference is what I want to talk about. This is a teleconference that occurred on the eve of the ill-fated launch in 1986. It represents a powerful example of the lost opportunity to reframe a debate. Lots of anger and emotion emerged in that meeting. It was clearly not a productive conversation. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the Challenger shuttle accident, again, it's a topic we're going to cover in much more detail in a later lecture. But let me just summarize what happened there. The shuttle exploded during the launch that day because O-ring erosion occurred, because of the cold temperatures in Florida on the day of the launch. The O-ring erosion allowed hot gases to leak out on the solid rocket boosters, and that leaking of gases led to the explosion that killed Krista McAuliffe, that school teacher on board that day, and all of the other astronauts on the Challenger. It's a tragic outcome. As it turns out, at the teleconference on the evening prior to the launch, there was concern expressed about the cold temperatures at the launch. Roger Boisjoly, an engineer at NASA, argued quite stridently and forcefully that we shouldn't launch. The temperatures are too cold. I believe cold temperatures is what causes O-ring erosion. O-ring erosion had been happening on prior launches of the Challenger, and he seemed to think there was some correlation between cold temperatures and that problem with the O-rings. And that day, they were talking about a launch that would take place at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or perhaps colder. There was ice overnight on the launch pad, and Boisjoly was very concerned. But he couldn't get his point across. He couldn't convince management to delay the launch, and there were heated words exchanged during that teleconference. My colleague, Amy Edmondson, has pointed out that the meeting participants could have avoided a dysfunctional debate and perhaps even prevented the disaster by reframing the discussion as a collective learning and problem-solving process, not as a win-lose proposition. She points out that the people did not ask inquisitive questions during the debate, but instead found themselves repeatedly defending their own positions. People didn't try to understand each other's thinking. They didn't put themselves in each other's shoes. The lack of inquiry meant that people didn't learn from one another, and they didn't leverage the collective expertise in the room. They simply became frustrated and emotional. During the meeting, Roger Boisjoly presented data on the temperatures at launch for those past flights with O-ring erosion incidents. The evidence showed no apparent correlation between temperature and O-ring failure. Thus, senior management was clearly unconvinced of the threat. You haven't shown correlation. Why should we delay the launch? This seems to be some belief you have, not grounded in any data, in reality. However, if the group had looked at all flights in the graph that they actually put together, all flights, not just those with O-ring incidents, but all flights, if they had plotted that graph, they would have recognized very quickly that a correlation did exist. That in fact, the only time that they'd had O-ring problems was when it was relatively cold, and every flight without an O-ring incident was a very warm weather launch. No one during the discussions asked for more data of this kind. No one asked for more data. And this, of course, is the tragedy of that teleconference. Amy Edmondson stresses the power of asking curious, non-threatening questions to help reframe a contentious debate and break a stalemate. For instance, she points out that someone could have asked senior management the following question, quote, "What kind of data would you need to change your mind and postpone the launch?" Edmondson argues that the likely response to that question might have been, "I would need data that suggests a correlation between temperature and O-ring erosion on past shuttle launches." And this might have spurred a great deal of further investigation and learning within the group. Specifically, group members together may have uncovered the correlation data that would have convinced senior executives at NASA to delay the launch. So how can we reframe the debate? What kinds of non-threatening, curious questions can we ask? And how can we use language productively? Well, Fisher and Urey, those negotiation scholars, have said there's five types of questions we ask in reframing a debate. And they've offered advice on how to ask those 5 questions. The first is the why question. You might ask somebody why they believe what they believe. But they think the right way to ask that is by saying, help me understand why you believe X, Y, or Z. By saying, help me, you're really making it a non-threatening question. Then there's the why not question. It's important to ask, why not pursue these other options? Instead of just criticizing the proposals by some other subgroup or some other individual in your team, instead of focusing on their option, bring other options to the table. That can help reframe the debate. Then there's the what if question. What if we found this assumption proved to be false? Here, again, we're getting away from focusing only on people's positions, and we're backtracking to look at underlying assumptions, another way of reframing the dialogue. So it's not just, is A right or B right? But wait, are the assumptions underlying A and B correct? Then there's the 4th type of question, the what would you do question. And here they say, the question you want to ask is, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Again, trying to get people to empathize, to put themselves in other shoes and understand their vantage point. And finally, what makes that optimal? Right? The 5th kind of question for reframing a debate. Here you might say, you must have good reasons for thinking that's an optimal solution. I'd like to hear them. In other words, if someone is simply stating their position and then restating it over and over, you say to them, no, explain to me your thinking. Give me your rationale. Take me inside your mind. Ask for help in understanding what they're saying. Another way of reframing the dialogue to get to more productive discussion. Finally, what can we do after the decision process has ended? Here we can evaluate the process and develop lessons learned for application in the future. We've talked about the importance of that after-action review. But there's more than just that we can do. We need to attend to damaged relationships and hurt feelings that sometimes simply are going to happen no matter how well we manage the debate. And importantly, sometimes those damaged feelings don't become apparent to everyone during the process. Chuck Knight, longtime chairman and CEO at Emerson Electric, remember, he designed his meetings to be confrontational by design when he planned strategy for that firm. But he told me that he always tried to repair any hurt feelings on the same day that a heated debate took place. Don't wait, he said to me. It's so important to act quickly. And one thing he did at the end of a conference, at the end of a day of intense strategic planning, he would take his team out to dinner, and he would always be sure to sit next to the person who'd sort of been bruised the most during the dialogue, who'd really been on the sort of rough end of some debates. Sit next to them, make sure that you work with them and keep an eye on that relationship and repair any damage that might have been done. Finally, ensure that people remember and even celebrate the effective ways in which disputes have been handled. When a tough dispute is worked through productively, hey, make that an exemplar. Celebrate it with your team. Levy, the chief executive at the Beth Israel, did this in an important way at one point when a contentious dispute emerged. He built on the satisfaction of his people when they learned to actually resolve that conflict more constructively. And he celebrated that instance with his team and with the broader organization. He got lucky in this regard because there was a heated debate and it got very dysfunctional in a particular meeting. And then they worked through it and they figured out how to make it a more productive dialogue. And several weeks later, they'd come to a good decision and people felt good about it. And interestingly, the 2 combatants, as he called them, actually coined a song about it. They coined the song to the tune of Down by the Levee, a play on the chief executive's name. And they sang the song at a senior management meeting, and Levy laughed. And then he told the story of the song and of these 2 combatants who had resolved their differences effectively. He told that story over and over and over, celebrating how they'd learned to have a productive dialogue and giving that as an example to the rest of the organization. A very powerful thing to do, to teach others the importance of key techniques for how to manage conflict effectively. Well, to close, let me say that leaders certainly can't resolve every dispute that arises during a complex decision-making process. They need help. They must develop the skills of their subordinates. Moreover, once a leader unleashes the power of divergent thinking, they inherently give up some control over the ideas and options that are discussed. Yet leadership always entails a broad responsibility for establishing the context in which people behave, as well as the processes that groups employ to initiate and resolve conflict. Leaders can and should shape and guide how people disagree, as well as the atmosphere in which that debate takes place. Along these lines, Larry Gelbart once reflected back on Sid Caesar's leadership of the wildly creative process in the writer's room for Show of Shows. Gelbart remarked, "He had total control, but we had total freedom," end quote.